Hey, welcome, AP World History students. This is your Unit 5 study guide. It's a big test, 50 questions. So you want to make sure and really use this as much as you can to help guide you for this, okay? All right, so let's talk about religions in Japan. Certainly in this time period, you always remember that the native religion in Japan is Shinto. But that Buddhism is going to make its way over from India into China, and from China into Japan. And those will be the two major religions that really occupy Japan. I feel like that's pretty easy to remember. We talked, age of exploration for the Chinese under the Ming Dynasty. You had the Seven Voyages by Zheng He. And, these kind of helped move Chinese prestige throughout the Indian Ocean and in the area around China. But eventually they did stop them because the government felt like they were too expensive and they really weren't getting enough out of the Seven Voyages to justify, still doing them. This is a time period that we saw the development of African slavery, European style, which is a little bit more than what the Muslims who had started African slavery, a little bit more intense than what they did. And there's a lot of results of this. You're pitting Africans versus Africans. You're altering, the number of males to the number of females in the country, which will lead to polygamy, of course. The prize slave that they would catch in raiding was the male slave, and those would sell for more at slave auctions in the New World. So that's certainly one of the biggest reactions there. The best and the brightest basically are being stolen from the continent. We had got the Columbian Exchange, a very important event that begins with Columbus's 1492 voyage. Remember, he takes 4 voyages. And that the trade network that's going to start up after the Columbian Exchange is going to be vastly important. Horses and pigs and diseases, of course, some negatives that come from the old world to the new world. New World's going to send back some squash and beans and, of course, the potato. So they'll send back a few things themselves. But we know that disease has a tremendous impact on Native Americans in the New World who had no immunities towards it. But yeah, and that's going to decimate almost 90% of the Native American population over the course of a couple hundred years there. All right. We talked just briefly. I put Songhai on here. There's sort of a difficult African dynasty to remember. But realize that they became big because of these trans-Saharan trade. They're a Western African empire. And trans-Saharan trade kind of puts them on the map. They're Muslim, and they do have the famous Islamic University at Timbuktu. I mean, those are all qualities that belong to the Songhai dynasty, Songhai Empire there in Western Africa. Taj Mahal, I mentioned it in class. When you talk about the Taj Mahal, you've got Shah Abbas, who's dedicating it to his dead wife, who he was very close to. But really, when they ask about the Taj Mahal, a lot of times they're asking architectural questions, and they want you to know that that's an Islamic architecture. It's a representation of Islamic architecture. So remember that. Ottoman Empire, one of the gunpowder empires. We talk about women's roles in these different societies, and we know with the Muslim societies that women are going to have pretty secondary roles. In the Ottoman Empire, while they were still secondary, there were often very powerful women that operated behind the scenes, behind closed doors. They couldn't do it publicly, but there were some very powerful women there in the Ottoman Empire. And we're going back to the slave trade. There are powerful incentives to get involved in the slave trade. You have a lot of cash crops, tobacco, rice, cotton, but the most important cash crop in the New World, of course, was sugar. And there's a lot of money to be had on these sugar plantations, and that's going to lead to an uptick in the African slave trade. New World food crops that are being traded. Potatoes, manioc, maize were some of the big ones. Beans and squash were some of the other ones. We kind of mentioned that earlier. All those are big trade items that are coming from the New World into the Old World. We got a lot of colonies in this time period, European colonies coming over and being founded, again, with the purpose of making the mother countries more money. And they're going to do this through cash crops for the most part, as far as England's concerned. There's some fur trading out of the French up north, but really the vast majority of the money being made is being made off of cash crops. So keep that in mind. Kind of bouncing back to the east, Neo-Confucianism, New Confucianism, pretty easy to remember. What is New Confucianism? This Chinese belief that came back, that founded back with Confucius's time, is that it is a blending, it's a mixing of Buddhism and Confucianism. So Buddhism coming in from India, making an impact felt in China, and so you've got a blending. So that's Neo-Confucianism. These two belief systems working together. We talked about the Manchus, the Manchurians, who ruled the Chinese with the Qing dynasty, which was the last Chinese dynasty that would last until 1911. Very similar, of course, to the Yuan dynasty of the Mongols. These are the two dynasties that ruled China that were foreigners. They were not native Chinese peoples that ruled them. So they had some similarities. They're going to ban intermarriage between the two different races or ethnicities there. They're going to make it, not allowing them to learn their languages. So they have a couple similarities there. These two, the Yuan and the Manchus. Keep that in mind. Akbar, remember Akbar the Great, another one of our gunpowder empires. He's a military guy, but he's probably best known for his tolerance. He was religiously tolerant. He's trying to basically get the Mughal dynasty to be accepted everywhere. He wants a religion that would unite India, which has always been a hard place to unite. He is going to get control over all of northern India, but he does try to establish that new religion called the divine faith. And that's to try to get the Christians, the Hindu, and the Muslims all on the same page. But we know that's not quite going to work. With the Ottomans, they instituted something kind of important that tends to show up on AP exams, and that's the Tanzimat reforms. And the Tanzimat reforms are going to allow their people access to Western culture, Western education. Remember that in the West, Europe, that they have become the most advanced people, and the Ottomans are right there bordering them, and so they realize this, and so they allow the Tanzimat reforms, because remember they're culturally conservative. They allow the Tanzimat reforms as a way to kind of help try to keep up with the Europeans. Ultimately, they're still going to fall behind, but they're trying with the Tanzimat reforms. When we compare. One of the questions we compare here, the Ottoman Empire and the Tokugawa shogunate. And, the Ottoman Empire is more in a place that's more of a cultural crossroads. So they draw influence from quite a different, a big group of different cultures and dynasties and stuff. Whereas the Japanese are more culturally isolated under the Tokugawa shogunate. And so they're not going to draw much influence from anybody else. Remember, they shut down the ports, all except for two, and eventually get down to one, really, with Nagasaki. We talked about the Reformation in this unit. We know that the Reformation was founded by Martin Luther, writing his 95 Thesis. There in Germany, it would end up causing a massive split in the Catholic Church, and millions of people would die through the religious wars that followed. Without a doubt, it would not have been nearly as big of a deal without the printing press. The printing press allowed this idea to spread like wildfire. And it shows you how mighty the pen can be, especially when it's got a printing press at its back to spread the ideas. And there's a lot of reasons that Martin Luther had support. A lot of other Christians like him felt like the Catholic Church was too corrupt. You also got some secular things going on. You have some princes it's a power grab for them. They realize that if the church is weak, that they can step in and they can gain some of that power. He wants the Bible. The Bible's the big deal with Martin Luther. It's the ultimate authority, not the priest, and that was a huge difference from how the Catholic Church had operated. So he wants the Bible translated into German. That's going to be a big deal for him. And the thing that started it all off, of course, was the selling of indulgences. Johann Tetzel, the merchant, the pardon merchant, as Martin Luther liked to call him. He's basically giving rich people passes on sinning as long as they donate money to build the cathedral. He was not a fan of all that. It's kind of kickstarted everything. Now, the Catholic Church isn't going to sit here and take all of this without trying to make changes to keep people coming to their church. So there's going to be a Catholic Reformation that follows immediately after the Protestant Reformation. They're going to get a council together, and they're going to say, we've got to be on the same page with our doctrine. We got to strengthen our commitment to our people. We got to fix some issues. We got a big PR issue going on, and we got to fix it. Or our church is going to go bye-bye. And it was fairly successful. And the Reformation has such wide-ranging effects. And, one of the big effects of it is witch hunts. You have such a climate of suspicion and violence following the Reformation. People are killing each other in ungodly numbers. And the witch hunts are a way to, basically take out your vengeance on people that you wanted to. And remember, the witch hunts were pretty misogynistic, pretty male dominated. It was mostly women that were witches and not men. So they paid the price. And really, probably if we're talking big winners from the Reformation, it's really the monarchs who are the big winners. It's going to help lead to absolutism. And monarchs are going to get a lot more power without being checked by the church like they had been throughout most of Europe's Middle Ages. That's all going bye-bye. And these new monarchs, they're going to make professional armies. They're going to have very large, centrally administered bureaucracies, whereas before they were very small and regional. They're going to tax better and more, and that's going to increase revenues. And they're going to take more power away from the nobles. These absolute monarchs will. They will gain power at the expense of both the church and the nobles. Now, Constitution, everything has an action, right? And absolute monarchy has a reaction, and that reaction is constitutional monarchy, where you're going to have some sort of document, like a constitution or something, that will limit to some degree the power of the monarch. So keep that in mind with the constitutional monarchies, that they've got to share authority. They got to recognize people's individual rights, leading into the Enlightenment movement. Now, probably the best known absolute monarch, the most powerful of all of them, was Louis XIV, French king who built the Palace of Versailles, a $2 billion building. He made all of his nobles move to the Palace of Versailles so he could keep an eye on them because he didn't trust them. He was really bad about running them down publicly. They hated him, I'm pretty sure, to the man, but he was so powerful that they really couldn't do anything about it. So they waited until he died. So he was the longest reigning monarch in European history, about 72 years. Peter the Great of Russia was also an absolute monarch. He's trying to fix Russia. He does a lot of good things, some territorial gains, of course, but he's best known for his Grand Embassy, where he went west in disguise to learn secrets of the Europeans so that Russia could industrialize and try to catch up. So that was a big deal for him. And he's going to force European fashions on his peoples. He's going to try to make them cut off their beards, if you remember. He's got to build St. Petersburg. That was a big deal to him, having a naval base, important city there. But he's going to modernize his troops, and he's going to take a lot of great ideas from Europe. You have, again, during the Reformation, all these religious issues going on. We get something called the Peace of Westphalia, which is very important. Essentially, it's in Germany, but essentially it's religious tolerance. They get so tired of killing each other, they finally say, you know what, enough's enough. And it's going to end something called the 30-Year War. And it says, hey, we're not going to fight over religion. That's gone too far. but Germany is still fragmented. You got a lot of princes vying for power, so Germany is broken up basically. Um, so that's the Peace of Westphalia there. Capitalism arises in this time period. You get things like the stock exchanges, and joint stock companies are immensely important, where people share the investment risk. Insurance companies develop because of capitalism, and banks become more developed because of capitalism as well. You had something called the putting out system, and that was profitable for a lot of different groups. Um, but unfortunately, the group that suffers from the putting out system was guilds. And remember that guilds had kind of come to control much of the towns, the growing towns in Europe. But the putting out system is going to have people doing stuff at home instead of belonging to a guild. So it really hurts them. And the putting out system, remember, is the early form of the Industrial Revolution, which we will learn later on. Scientific revolution happens in this time period. A lot of big names. Perhaps the greatest scientist of the scientific revolution was Isaac Newton. And we know that Isaac Newton has his laws of gravity, but more than anything, he gives us the idea that everything follows the rules, that the universe follows a set of rules, and that won't be challenged until Albert Einstein goes against it in the early 1900s, and we'll talk about that when we get there. He's got Newton's universe makes people feel safe, basically, because it's got rules. We talked about conquistadors, and probably the most famous conquistador, of course, is Hernando Cortez, who conquers the Aztecs. And one of the big helps for him is his mistress, Donna Maria, who can speak several different native tongues. She picked up Spanish very quickly, perhaps as quick as even a week, serves as an interpreter, and ends up having his child. But that certainly helps him gain allies to help him take out the Aztecs, who were pretty hated because, they had all those human sacrifices. Now, so the Spanish are doing really bad things. They've come over for money. They're exploiting the Indians. They exploited them in the encomienda system. They're going to make them work, and they're going to say, hey, we're giving you something in exchange. We're protecting you. We're bringing Christianity to you. The system can't be that bad. But of course, we know that many, many Indians were dying in the encomienda system. It was pretty brutal, and they were dying of disease in high numbers. And that goes back to Cortez being able to conquer the Aztecs, and the Aztecs were very powerful warriors. They had strong defense, but he had superior technology. Smallpox wipes them out, of course. He had native allies. All those things help Cortez, and that kind of helps lead into the encomienda system coming later. Now, so Spain is going to allow something called a viceroy, are going to be kind of their local rulers. And these viceroys are a world away. But the Spanish crown, they're not looking for brand new empires getting started. So they're going to keep the viceroy's power in check. They're going to keep a close eye. These are going to be royal colonies. Whereas some of the English colonies were joint stock companies. They weren't royal colonies. So you had investors that were running them. So a little bit different there. Portugal. We know that Brazil becomes the Portuguese colony. Some of this is really just through luck because of the Treaty of Tordesillas draws this imaginary line through the New World so that Spain and Portugal would stop fighting with each other. They didn't know how much land was behind that line, so Portugal kind of got the short end of the stick. They ended up with Brazil, which is a great colony, but the Spanish get a lot of territory. English settlements in the north. They're not going to grow fast in the beginning because they weren't very smart as far as making sure that they had enough food. Jamestown has, a starving time. Of the first 530-something people that go to Jamestown, only about 32 end up surviving, and that's really because of the Indians. So they needed to do a lot better job of farming in the beginning. So they grew slowly, but eventually they're coming over in families, and it's going to be good for English colonies. And, of course, these English colonies are going to steal a lot of land, but they're going to tell you, they're going to look you right in the eye. Hey, we made a treaty with the Indians. They agreed to everything we took. They signed off on it when they knew dang good and well that they were exploiting the natives, that they were taking advantage of their different culture. And the Native Americans never understood exactly what they were giving away. And so the white people took advantage of that. You had a lot of mixed races in the New World, especially in Central and South America. You had, at the top of the group was the Peninsulares, who were originally from the Old World, originally Spanish, originally Portuguese or whatnot. And, below them, of course, you had the Creoles, and they were their children, but they were born in the New World, in Brazil or in Mexico. So there will be some social tension between those two groups. So make sure you know the differences between them. For Spain, they've come over here and they're making their money really off of silver and gold more than anything else. They're going to steal all that Spanish, all that Aztec gold and all the Inca gold, and that's where they make the bulk of their money. The English and the French are going to come in later on and push them out, and they're going to make their money off of cash crops. Fur trade, that's north in Canada for the most part, a little bit in modern day America. And they're going to start, Native Americans are going to start getting their hands on European weapons. It's going to cause a lot of competition between European countries such as the French, the Dutch, and even the English. And they wipe out like beaver populations and stuff like that. There's some negative aspects to the fur trade, for sure. But European traders, fur traders, and Native Americans tend to have pretty good relations. Australia, our one and only question about Oceania. Australia is very isolated. It was, of course, a penal colony for England, and it's far away from everything. So the first explorers, they're really not interested in settlement there in the beginning. The land didn't look like it would be good for settlement. They had issues like the Great Barrier Reef that threw them for a loop, and the Aborigine people were pretty firmly entrenched there. And in the beginning, they were pretty powerful, and so that drove a lot of potential settlers out. Last question we'll talk about: indentured servants. We know that indentured servants came over to fill a labor need in the beginning before slavery really took off. Typically, these were people who were in prison for like owing money and stuff. They were debtors, and they're willing to sign a contract for 4 to 7 years for their work. And at the end of it, they're probably going to own some land, and they're hoping that they can become, an artisan or a planter or something. They're dreaming big, that they'll sacrifice, that they'll essentially be a slave for 4 to 7 years. But at the end of it, there's light at the end of the tunnel that good things will happen for them. Okay, 1450 to 1750 is a short period, only 300 years, but there is a lot going on, and that's why this period gets such a short time period. So a lot of names, a lot of terms. You can see on the map here. It's a good map. Pay attention to it. It kind of shows you how the world's broken up in this time period. Note cards. And I hope that you guys do an excellent job on your tests. So good luck, and I will see you guys.